Realm is a game with a ton of items, and some of them fulfill roles that put them much above others. For the most part, there is a general consensus on what items are amazing and what ones are relatively garbage. While I find that the opinions of where items stand in viability are mostly true, I do think that some items in the game are overrated by a fair bit. Now obviously the list of overrated items in this video are based off of my experience using the item, points I've seen people make, and just my overall opinion. Some of the items on the list may make no fucking sense to you, but I'll try my best to make it make sense. For the most part, every item on this list is pretty good, but I just don't think they're as good as the community makes it out to be, and this may be somewhat controversial as a result. The first item on the list is the Helm of the Juggernaut. Before you press X on the browser and think about how you got to the point where you're hearing this bullshit, please hear me out. I'd say Jug is probably one of the most coveted and desired items in the game, and I'd say it's for fairly good reason. You trade Speedy for Armored while still retaining Berserk. After the in-combat, out-of-combat patch, Armored was nerfed from a 2x increase in defense to a 1.5x increase. Just a quick disclaimer, when I talk about these items being overrated, I'm talking about it in an endgame sense, as an item like Jug in early game can't really be considered overrated because it's just that good. Yeah. In areas like the Godlands, in most Godland tier dungeons where you can face tank everything with Armored, it is insanely useful and it also helps you stay out of combat. However, when you get to later stages of the game, its usefulness falls off drastically as defense as a stat becomes less useful. Now what I mean by this is that enemies begin to shoot shots that just do fucking stupid amounts of damage, as well as more shots armor piercing to a point where HP is much more a valued stat compared to defense. And keep in mind the tier 7 helmet gives 40 HP. Take Oryx's Sanctuary and the Void Entity for example. The lowest shot from the Void Entity is 150 and the highest is 425, so if you get hit by any shot in the Void you'll be slapped into combat anyways, and on top of this a lot of Void shots silence, so you may not be able to maintain 100% uptime on your Armored buff. Osank as a whole has an abundance of high damaging shots, but for some mini bosses I can see where Jug is probably very useful. In a lot of dungeons however I feel like Speedy is a much more useful buff to have than Armored, but don't get me wrong, in a lot of situations Jug is an absolutely amazing item. Not giving Speedy while keeping Berserk is great in and of itself, and there are a lot of scenarios where Armored could be a godsend when clearing dungeons for example, because minion shots can stack up. The next item on the list is Lumiere. Now I know a lot of good players probably want me crucified for saying this, but I do think the item is overrated a fair bit, definitely by myself in the past. It's the best DPS one by far, but that is on paper. Now obviously if you look at a DPS chart, your monkey brain is telling you, me see big number, me like, but the DPS you see on the chart is basically impossible to reach unless the enemy you're shooting at is stationary, moving in a set pattern, or you are the second coming of Jesus. Because of the short speed, enemies that move in an erratic pattern are extremely difficult to hit, and when you try to aim based on current movement instead of leading your shots, it will look something like this. The weapon has an extremely high skill ceiling, and in my case where I personally feel like I'm about average using the one, there are cases where I definitely get more damage from using Fallen. At the end of the day, it's still an incredibly good weapon, and if you're able to get good with the one, then it's GG's. But I do think a lot of people look at a number on a DPS chart and instantly assume it's a 1-to-1 of what you can achieve in game consistently, but that's not the case for many weapons, this one in particular. Mercy's Bane is an armor that places great emphasis on your dodging ability in order to use it effectively. It gives 7 attack, 7 dex, which sounds relatively crispy, but the downside of giving 10 defense. I personally dislike this armor despite me wanting it so much in the past, because I feel like it does sacrifice too much for DPS. I see it rated highly a lot, probably because of the ever-present DPS meta, but I don't know, I don't really think it's that practical in the grand scheme of things outside of a few scenarios. On a class like the Knight or a Jug Warrior, I could see it being pretty decent because the defense loss is accounted for. As I said earlier, defense is a stat that does lose its usefulness in the endgame, but there is still a case of too low defense, as you can find yourself getting shredded by minions constantly if you wear armor like this. Colo and Divinity can make up for the defense loss in range, but I think Gladiguard is vastly superior in 99% of scenarios. You trade 4 DPS stats for 10 defense and 7 speed, and to me that choice is a no-brainer. Mercy's however is a better option in a speedrun setting where there's like little to no risk, or you're just really good at the game, but I don't think it's as good as it's hyped up to be. The last item I'm going to talk about about in depth is the Orb of Conflict. This is something that I was relatively on the fence about, but after thinking it over, I do think that it gets a bit too much gas. Conflict differs from other tiered orbs as it has the ability to grunt, speedy and damaging at the expense of not being able to curse. It also gives 10 DPS stats total. Speedy is always nice to have, and damaging is great to have in a solo environment. Due to the nature of the game, however, a very large amount of content is done within a group. As far as I know, Speedy is a buff that cannot be granted to a group as a whole, but damaging can. Most of the time you'll have a paladin in the group you're doing content with, so you're left with the stasis, speedy and DPS stats. The +5/+5 is nice, but the Agent of Warriors Orb gives 8 on top of cursing, doing a lot of stationary damage and providing an attack boost. Speedy is nice, but the problem is it isn't unique just to Conflict. The Soul of the Bearer has speedy, but to be fair is on a cooldown. If you're rushing shatter switches or just by yourself, then Conflict is probably the best orb for a mystic to have in that situation, but a lot of the time I kinda do feel like it's just sitting in your inventory. I don't think it's as good as an event where it should be, as even the phylactery orbs give speedy and a DPS buff while also being tradable and much more accessible to get, but I don't know, that's probably a brick take. I'm very interested to hear what people's opinions are, as I'm sure there's something I haven't realized about these items. If you have any video ideas, leave them in the comments below, and that's all from me. If you've made it this far, a like and or a subscription would be much appreciated. Thank you very much for watching, and make sure to enjoy the rest of your day or